All right, hey everybody, it's Jason Sheftel here, and today we're going to talk really quickly about the new Chinese GDP numbers that came out and a little bit about, God, the whole saga around Chinese GDP. I haven't done a video on this yet, and there's a whole story to be told, but I'll kind of just tell a bit of it in the context of what's been going on now with the 2021 sort of fourth quarter GDP, 2021 in general, and just the overall trend with Chinese growth, which is a really major story for the whole world right now and for what we're all expecting about the global economy to look like as everything shifts all around us. So, yeah, the last quarter of 2021, Chinese GDP grew around 4%, and overall annual GDP in China during 2021 was 8.1%, according to the Chinese numbers on all this. And these are, again, pretty big numbers for almost any country on Earth, but really not for China. This is down from last year, from 2021. From 2020. The difference, of course, with 2020, it was a really weird year because of the original pandemic shock. So that was kind of a outlier for a lot of reasons. But the bigger story is that Chinese GDP is way down from the mid 2010s, right? Or even the heyday during the 2000s when it was over 10%, right? That era, that phase of development in the Chinese growth story that we've all witnessed, that's really over. And it's actually more over than even these GDP numbers suggest, because the way China is getting these numbers and the policies it's been taking to keep GDP high, all of this is massively inflating what is really there. And real numbers in China would probably be the authentic sort of long-term, viable, self-sustaining sort of growth that you want. That stuff's less than 3% in China, almost certainly at this point. So that is important to keep in mind. And what the world also should keep in mind, although it's a really tough thing to even think about, is just, well, China is the biggest contributor to global GDP. So that means that I think it's something like 20% of the expected GDP through, like, say, 2030 was going to be attributed to China. So as Chinese GDP growth slows, and slows more quickly than people were expecting, this means it's downhill for the broader prospects in the global economy, right? Especially for countries that are and companies that are really linked in with China in a major way, whether on the production side or the consumption side. And I have a couple videos on this, just talking about how expectations around the world, and particularly in multinational companies, which are, especially on the financial side, which are totally insane about how they're thinking about this. They're not really considering where things are going, and they kind of have to, right? They have to keep having this quarter over quarter growth, but that's a quick separate story. Check out some of the other videos on that. But the other part to this is that, like I was saying, this specific data about 8.1% growth or 4% here or this or that, this is almost useless from the point of getting a real picture about what's going on. It does help with the year-to-year trends and to see specific sector stuff and to see specifically how certain Chinese policies, say, in the property market are shaking out, what's happening with retail and consumer spending and all this kind of stuff, right? Production, there's obviously a lot of value, but we've been living in a world where the Chinese numbers have been so bad for so long, so off for so long, that we do have like 4 prior series data about what happened, but it's also prior series data that's very skewed. So the gist of it is that China has a very different idea about what GDP means, and I'll probably just get into that in a different video because it's too much for this right now. But yeah, in general, it ain't what it looks like at all. And that's fine. It doesn't even really quite matter, because the general trend is that this is really slowing. And that is a really tough thing for China to hear and for the world to hear, because things are very much getting crazy in China, right? So the way that China keeps up these high growth numbers in general, it's by juicing industries that China, by its own admission, says it needs to stop juicing, right? And the big problem points are always infrastructure, this insane fixed asset investment, property and construction, and then the export sector in general, right? These are really the major contributors to what China's been up to the last 10 years, as it's been not changing its growth model to something that's more consumption led. These are the sectors that have continued to be the major drivers of growth. And also there's sectors that the Chinese government can really push hard, right? It can really do things to, say, capture foreign markets for all sorts of goods by subsidizing things, by getting massive production runs, right? So you get cheap energy, cheap labor, you get massive government loans, and then you have access to a global market. So you're able to just capture using cheap prices, and then using the massive production runs that these companies put out, they're able to capture markets for intermediate commodities, the stuff involved in the new battery supply chain for electric vehicles, in solar panels, and in all sorts of industries, really from really low tech stuff to some increasingly high tech stuff. And that's been a way that China's been able to grow things. And exports in particular are very important because they get China really useful hard currency, dollars, stuff like that, that is always useful for the way that China's sort of export oriented model has really functioned, and it really allows it to stabilize things with its own currency and all sorts of stuff like that. But construction, property, infrastructure, all this is also another area that's insanely easy for China and the Chinese government to have control over, right? The problem with a consumer economy, which is what the United States has and which is what China supposedly wants, is that a real consumer economy isn't as run by the government, right? That is both the benefit to it, because you get all sorts of weird new products and services, from the really stupid and useless to the really innovative and powerful and potentially transformative, right? And that's a very good thing, but it also, by its definition, gives less control to the government, especially if you have one that's, again, really consumer driven. All right, there's a lot of countries that have mixed economies and they're involved in a broader consumer world economy, but their role is much more niche, like something like Germany, where credit and investment and loans that you get in Germany, they're much more geared towards businesses and towards production and towards feeding the consumer desires in places like the United States than to actually having much of their own self-sustaining or self-directed consumer market. And again, it's probably too small of a market for that to really work, but that's sort of the way it works. If China really wants a consumer economy, it has to accept the problems and the lack of centralized control that would likely come with it. And the truth is, the Chinese government has no interest in this, really, deep down. Clearly, if anyone's looking at what's happened during 2021, there's almost no chance that the Chinese government is going to just allow willy-nilly consumer forces to run amok in China, right? You look at what's happened with the celebrity culture and random attacks against effeminacy in China, male effeminacy, or the tutoring industry, or online video games, or a lot of tech sectors, elements of the tech sector in general. All of them are getting hit, and a lot of it comes down to the fact that the Chinese government is very unwilling to allow rampant consumer behavior if it thinks it's, well, if it goes against the control that the government needs to maintain political authority in China, or if it goes against what it considers broader social goods or policies. All of this is just extremely an anathema to the way that the Chinese government operates. So that is a really big thing. And these are, again, the sectors that are really pumping things forward in 2021. And as everyone knows, the property sector in particular has had troubles. This is one area where China has such a massive problem that's built up because it's refused to actually allow things to reorient and rationalize in the property sector. And there's a whole thing about this. I have a video that you guys should all check out. It's about Evergrande, and it actually got cut out at the end, but it's still really good. It talks about a lot about what's going on and stuff like that. And this is one area where China has really tried to control or limit the amount of credit in basically the production and the excess production and overinvestment that's going on in the sector. It's been trying to limit it, ameliorate it, right? Really not limit it, just like tamp it down a little bit. And so that actually has crimped growth in China. So that's there, but it's still the baseline is so high that that's still the way it is. And a lot of the infrastructure investment and the exports, particularly exports where everybody's needed new stuff, has really, helped to make up for that growth, right? And property is just so big a problem. And China looks at the United States, it looks at the subprime crisis, it looks at even Japan in the late 80s. There's you just don't even, you can look basically anywhere in history. There's a deep, dark nexus between finance and real estate, and that tends to blow up, right? So China is really focused on that. But like I said, exports are a key thing that happened this year that were really the same way that 2020, there was the whole shock. There was a huge push towards more exports to feed the world all sorts of various supplies it needed as the shutdowns went on and as more materials were needed to counter the effects of the pandemic around the world, et cetera. Similar thing happened in 2021, in addition to the massive consumer spending that China was taking advantage of in the United States, right? So all the people who wanted Pelotons and random home goods and all sorts of stuff. That was clearly any of the goods that you bought that were made in China. Well, that boosted the Chinese economy in the short term, in the short term, and that is actually a good thing for right now. That boosts these numbers, but the truth is this will eventually rebalance, and it's going to rebalance downward, right? As I was just saying at the beginning of this, China was a huge percentage of global growth. That's going down. China is not transitioning to a consumer economy. That is very bad. And we live in a new era of a global protectionism and nationalism, in addition to depopulation, right? So the consumer world, the global consumer economy entirely is shrinking all around the world. And alongside that, we have new protectionism and nationalism and all the stuff that's coming up, that people want vaccines made in their own country. They want personal protective gear made in their own country. They want all of that, in addition to classic things like national defense articles, and now increasingly everything related to transportation and lithium and all the stuff that goes into electric vehicles. All this pushes against trying to run on an export-driven economy, in addition to the fact that this naturally peters out in general, and it also makes you beholden to other countries in various ways, right? This is another reason why exports, not even because China thought it was bad, but being export-driven puts you at the mercy of your customers. That is another thing the Chinese Communist Party didn't want, but it doesn't really have much choice about it in this situation, right? And so a lot of people are always saying, well, is the United States sort of beholden to China because it buys all this stuff from it? Well, maybe, but usually actually it's the buyer who has the power, right? Are you beholden to someone if you're trying to buy a house, right, from a random seller, right? It's not really. Obviously, if you have control, if China has mass control over markets, if it has monopolistic control over many markets, then it gets power, right? But it's actually not as hard to diversify away overall over a long enough period of time from China than people actually think. And there's a lot of reasons for it that I'll probably get into in a different video because it's not quite on this one. But I don't nearly worry as much about many of the supply chain challenges that people are really, really fixated on. There's a sort of simple history to them, and like what I touched on earlier about the fact that China's just trying to boost its export control over all sorts of industries and boost the employment and the currency and the revenue and the economic activity associated with all that. That's a big reason why it ended up in a position where it has all this control over all these industries. But as the world has caught on that this stuff matters, and that COVID has really accelerated this push towards, well, basically forms of protectionism, nationalism, or at least regionalism in the sense of Europe or NAFTA or whatever, this is going to make a lot of that stuff not go away, but become much harder to do. China's not going to be able to have control over these export markets that it really needs if it wants to try and have a really more self-directed export economy, which again, by definition, this is a really, really tough thing to do, and it's not going to pan out anyway. So there's not even that much of a reason to focus on it. But nonetheless, in China, the export show just goes on, right? It just goes on because China doesn't have other options, right? Like I mentioned, there's many reasons, in addition to the reason that the consumer economy lowers government political control over a lot of aspects of the economy. There's other reasons China hasn't pushed towards it. One being that the Chinese population is busting as we speak. But that's what happens. And the after effects of this, the fact that China hasn't moved from these other areas, is that you get the crazy investment in the export sector, you get the crazy investment in the property sector, which is even deeper for a lot of reasons. That actually is a consumer good in a lot of ways. And that's a very perverted, not perverted, but sort of like distorted. Yeah, I guess perverted. Like in a lot of countries, you get this really deep, almost perverse relationship between people and property because it's both an asset, it's both a consumption good because you're like, oh, I get to live here, this is fun, this is great. It's also an asset. And in a place like China, it's also extremely necessary for social advancement, right? To get a spouse, to do all sorts of things. You often need apartments. And then it becomes, again, in China, it becomes one of the only investment goods because you don't really quite have the same sort of financial markets, capital markets, stock markets, access to a variety of investment opportunities. It's just a very difficult situation, and it ends up with a very perverse relationship between people in the property sector, local governments in the property sector, national government in the property sector, property developers and consumers and everything. So there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on there. And then the investment binge China's been on for God knows since the 90s, where it's invested more of its GDP in infrastructure 4 years than any country ever. It's long since tapped out what it can do there. And all of these factors, all these forces, they're basically tapped out, but China's still pushing them. And meanwhile, like the actual growth, the actual stuff that China would need to move things forward, the consumer growth is limp, and the tech sector, which would push China forward even further, like roughly speaking, you have population growth and you have productivity driven growth in your economy. And basically the sort of population growth is sort of labor force growth, consumer market growth. It's all the associated things, the people and products and behaviors associated with having more people that are functioning as part of your economy. And China's had that as it's moved people from the countryside into the city. It's had that in various ways, and it's been able to make up for some of the real serious problems it has in its demography. But as you get less and less of that market growth, right, you get that really small consumer growth, and then you get very limited productivity and tech growth, you're starting to just see the basic equation of how you're going to have economic growth in a country really start to collapse, right? And so that makes sense. I mean, that makes sense. And it also makes sense that China is, it accompanied the release of its new GDP numbers for the last year and for the fourth quarter with a People's Bank of China announcement that it was lowering interest rates, right, by, 10 basis points. And for people who don't know, I mean, basically what you do when a country and a central bank is lowering interest rates, it's trying to increase lending and increase economic activity. Typically, you don't do that when there's an inflationary environment because that could lead to more inflation. So that is right. So right now, the U.S. Federal Reserve is actually signaling that it is going to, probably in March or so, start raising rates because it's very worried about the new inflationary environment that the world lives in. But in China's so worried about the collapse in growth that it's willing to lower these rates because from the party's perspective, that is far more important than the inflation problem. It's just one is far more key. And again, the inflation issue is far worse for a country like the United States with its consumer economy and all this kind of stuff. In China, the overall wages of the entire household wage share of the total national income is lower structurally. And so that is less of an issue in general. But also, this is just a sign of the fact that China knows that this is a bad situation and is trying to improve its economic profile by doing basically what Turkey is doing and lowering rates even in an already inflationary environment. And we'll see where that goes. But it is not something that a country who is very confident and happy with its numbers would do right away afterwards, right? Typically, you would say, well, we'll stay the course or things are great. But things are really changing. And it's actually a very difficult time for China in general because its government structure is really, really not meant for dealing with so many multiple conflicting issues: economic, political, public health, financial, monetary, all this at once. And in a sense, no government is, right? They're best if they just have one thing to hit at one at a time, right? Or you have agencies that can just run on autopilot. You don't have to really worry about what each one is doing and know what happens at basically the healthcare ministry or whatever you have in each particular country. This is just a very tough situation, but it's also tough for China because so much of its credibility is rooted in the fact that it's going to handle everything extremely well and extremely competently. And it's just how you do that when you're trying to handle 10 fires all at once is a really big challenge, right? I mean, the last time China's really had to do something like this in modern times is probably the 90s when China really unwound some of the real core old socialist communist structures that gave it a real property market, gave it better financial markets, gave it access to all sorts of elements of the global system in a more durable way. And it basically had to undo whole sectors of whole core definitions about how parts of its economy ran. And something similar has to happen. But the truth is China has no plans or really a method to shift to being a consumer economy, right? That's the gist of what these GDP numbers say.